to another interview at the Rise World Summit, a fireside chat, actually, as John himself reminded me, so that we will be discussing and debating. So, John, really happy to have you on board with us and spending your time at a time which is totally really early morning for you and late evening for us. So it just shows how technology can be so great. So really, to get it started, maybe John, a little bit about yourself and why you were here with us and what can we hope to hear from you. Yes.
Well, I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me. As probably is made clear in my bio, I'm an evaluator. I've been doing this work for about 30 years around the world. I'd say largely in the US, but also internationally quite a bit. My interest is, well, I have many interests. They're a bit varied. I've done quite a lot of work around scaling impact. I co-wrote a book with Robert McLean with that title. I do work in understanding new methods for describing and measuring impact, helping people manage the work they do, and also to tie it to program design. How do we design efforts to make the world a better place? And I tend to do this for organizations regardless of their interest in making money. So I see the need for organizations to focus on impact in addition to or instead of making money, and that this should really be a universal concern of all organizations that are acting in the world. Increasingly, that's becoming the case, but it's really been a slow change towards that. So, I have some nerdy interest in methods, but I have a deeper interest in understanding human beings and how to make their lives better.
So, John, thank you so much for reminding us all about a people-first approach, because I think, like you said, methods are important. They act as guardrails for what we do. And of course, processes have to be put in place. But at the end of the day, it is a human-centric approach that is really going to make the difference, right? Also, you mentioned your book and you said the first part of the name, which is, of course, scaling impact. But the second part, which is to me, actually, and I'm sure to our audience as well, going to be a lot more interesting, is that scaling impact, innovation for the public good. And I think that's really the interesting part, right? So maybe we'll start right there. If you could share something on what is public good for you, and how do we actually innovate for public good? Yeah.
Right. Well, I think the public good is a concept that is also having a bit of a resurgence. We've had difficulty articulating what we mean by making the world better for people. And I think the public good tries to encompass that. So I guess the first thing to recognize is that with every organization, there's an internal audience and there's an external audience. And not just audiences, but people who have some sort of a stake or interest or are affected by these things. And organizations in the past, if they were focusing on making money, and even to some extent, if they had as their mission improving the planet or the lives of people, they tend to focus a lot on those internal groups. They look inside to make decisions about what's good or bad, rather than looking outward. And the minute you begin to look outward, it becomes a messy problem because people will not agree. People will have different perspectives. They have different levels of control. And all of this means that we have to, I think, when we're concerned with the public good, understand the variety of perspectives people have. And we have to have a legitimate way in which those differences are served, either by finding a compromise or by providing more than one way of meeting needs. But there has to be a solution that works as much as possible for everyone and doesn't balance the equation too much by putting power too much in one person's hands or one group's hands. So that's the public good part. It's difficult. And we talk about it in the book about ways of trying to balance that and what we mean by that. On the innovation side, I'd say that innovation is really any way that we can, or since we're focusing largely on the actions of organizations, whether the kinds of things that organizations can do, that weren't available previously. A new way to create a product, a program, a service, a policy that wasn't there before and has some potential benefit that did not exist before. And we're constantly searching for these innovations. We're trying to find better ways to do the work that we do that affects other people. So we're quite broad in thinking about innovation. And really, it's an innovation is anything that allows you to accomplish something that previously could not be accomplished. And that can be in any domain. It doesn't have to be technological. It can be a policy. It can be the way you bring people together in a coalition can be the innovation. So we think quite broadly about that.
The definition of public good, and I like the way you said that it doesn't kind of favor any particular person or group, right? And at the same time, the whole concept of equity, the whole concept of equality, inclusion, diversity is around that, right? That favoring some over the other for various reasons. And that has become controversial, in fact, right? It has also become a point of, in some cases, even conflict, So keeping that in mind, how do you really say that what is public good and what is social good, Is it always the same or are they different concepts?
Well, I think it really would depend on the context you're in, because those terms are not used in a consistent fashion. The way that we talk about it in the book is that organizations should take actions that the people who are affected would endorse. And we use the expression would endorse because it's usually not possible for us to sort of get everyone who may be affected to learn about what we're doing and get them to weigh in. So we're trying to find ways, methods that would approximate that. If everybody knew what choices we had in front of us, if everybody knew what choice we made, if everybody understood as well as we do, or even better, how they would be affected by the actions that we take, would they be looking at what we do and say, yes, that makes sense, you should do that? And we have to do, and that becomes, that's a kind of, that's an ideal that we can't achieve, but we strive for. And it's an ideal that brings its own set of problems to what we're doing. Because if we could imagine knowing what everybody thought was a good idea, we could find that people want mutually exclusive things that benefit them. So we need a legitimate way to reconcile those differences. And that's a very difficult thing to arrive at outside of, say, a democratic process, outside of a participatory process. And much of what we do with organizations falls outside of those sorts of things. Some people have suggested that markets can act in that way. And for a fairly narrow set of goods and services, they can. But more broadly, they can't. So I think this is really it's a bit of a Wild West, an unknown, a place for more development and innovation. But we've at least tried to describe what we're striving for. And we have some examples in the book of organizations that we think have gone about that reasonably well, from whom we could learn.
Absolutely. I think I like the word endorsed because, and we cannot be in a place of utopia. I think that's the reality. You can strive for it, but you're never going to really be there, right? There's always going to be room for improvement. There's always going to be room for, change, right? And therefore you can never be in that state of utopia. So thank you, yes, for sharing that. So let's talk a little bit about innovation. One of my professors once told me that innovation is defined as finding solutions to two contrasting constraints. Okay, meaning two constraints that you could do one, but you cannot do the other because they are in direct conflict. So. Do you find when you talk of innovation, when you looked at innovative strategies, did you find something similar like this in terms of constraints that you had to do, which really were at odds at each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one way to think about innovation, and I think it's a useful way, that there's a universe of possibilities at any given time, and the world and our understanding of the world and our technology, all of this imposes some limit or constraint on what we can do and what we can expect to happen. And what an innovation does is it pushes the boundaries of those constraints out so that we have more possibilities and the ability to achieve something that previously we couldn't. And that's the basic idea of an innovation. But if we think about that across, say, the social sciences, around organizations that are trying to create good in complex environments, everyone, by necessity, is striving to find an innovation because the current set of possibilities is largely inadequate. So we're all pushing that boundary in our work, trying to find some advantage. And that is why innovation in this sphere is so central. It's so important, and why I think it's why the notion of scaling also becomes extremely relevant, because innovations always start as some idea, something small, something that's possible, but they don't have the power to create change until they've reached some level of maturity and reach and quality and efficiency that makes them really meaningful to society as a whole. And what we talk about in the book is that process should be strategic, it should be intentional, and the objective should not be maximizing your scale, but it should be finding the optimal scale, because there will also be trade-offs and constraints around this innovation that you bring into the world. And it's also time-bounded. You know, there are innovations that we had 10 years ago that we would like to let go of now for better innovations that have come along. And so understanding that there are bounds and a kind of temporality around innovation, and that scaling should be working within that, I think is a bit of a new idea, because scaling is so strongly associated with simply more is better and bigger is better, and let's be in charge of everything. And that may not be the ideal for the public good.
Absolutely. And, talking about scale, you of course talk about descaling. And again, here there's something which I think there's so much similarity in terms of how we talk about this, that scale and sustainability are two things that I think the development sector is absolutely obsessed with. Okay. Everything has to scale, right? But the truth is that, and this is what I used to say, there is another S that we need to get obsessed with even more. And I think that is spread, So while scale is good, sustainability, of course, is required. You don't necessarily have to scale all the time just by more. You can also scale by spreading it and going in a lateral manner rather than just in a vertical manner. So I think that's something that you also talk in terms of descaling and, with the many different thoughts on that. So yeah, if you'd like to take that one up too. Yeah.
So another central idea that's emerged from our work is the importance of distinguishing between operational scale and scaling impact. And so as managers, as people who run organizations, especially if you're involved in any way with funding or asking for money for your program, you're very focused on operational scale. You need resources, you need people, you need new sites, you need all this. And it's a real challenge for managers. But those are all means, right? Those are means. And the ends that we're looking for is something different about the impacts on some dimension. It could have to do with magnitude, it could have to do with equity, it could have to do with their sustainability, it could have to do with all kinds of things around the impacts that we want to be different. And we want to separate those means from the ends, and we want the ends to be what drives the scaling process, not the means. And when you begin to look at the operational scale part of the equation, that you're changing the way an organization acts in order to change the nature of the impacts it creates, then with that operational scale side, you realize that there are a set of strategies that people are using over and over again there. And so we do spend some time describing them. And since the book has been out, we've expanded that list, which we present in the workshops. And one of those approaches to scaling is descaling, that there can be a time when you realize doing less of your current innovation is better for everyone, perhaps even stopping it altogether. And that might be because you have a new innovation to replace it with. Or it could be because somebody else has an innovation to replace it with. Or it could be that the context has changed and made the way you're approaching the problem no longer an effective way or the best way. So this is something which is quite difficult for organizations to do because operational scale is what makes them thrive and makes them sustainable as an organization. But again, that doesn't always translate perfectly into what's best for the public good. So this whole idea that for-profit companies should now be thinking about the public and changing how they act is very important. But it's also true for NGOs. It's also true for funders having to do the same thing. Even though they're very focused on the public, there are times when they have to do things that seem counter to their everyday work, doing less, bringing it in, stopping. That is quite difficult to accept and to embrace.
Yeah, so I think, the way you put it about operational scale versus scaling impact, I think it's a very easy way for, I think, anyone to understand the difference in terms of what we meant by scale and then spread. The other part to scaling, okay, and especially operational scale, as you said just now, and you spoke about for-profits and nonprofits, is about mission drift. Do you think that funders and donors need to keep that in mind as well when they are weighing this operational scale and scaling impact, that very often there is a mission drift that actually is in between that happens, because of which you cannot scale impact necessarily just through operational scale?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think mission drift is a potential problem in many settings, and it can be caused by many things. With scaling, one of the reasons you see it is scaling itself becomes the mission. So the organization believes it must scale. We refer to this as the scaling imperative in our book. And we present to our readers the idea that they should keep in mind that scaling is always a choice. There's no imperative to scale. Funders may be requiring it. You may feel the pressure to do it, but it's always a choice. And it's a choice that has to be justified. And it should be justified with the people who are affected by what you're doing. So you're always making this choice. And once you begin to scale, you should be thinking about, is this still the right thing for us to do? And scaling doesn't always mean making the organization bigger. I should be clear about that. That's kind of where we go at first, more people, more sites. But it also has to do with changing how you do the work. You may change the nature of how you interact with people, the environment around you, and you become more efficient in some sense. Either you're more likely to create an impact with people, or you're creating a larger variety of impacts. And so this kind of efficiency also scales impact without necessarily changing operational scale very much or at all. So the idea that scaling becomes the mission, and where scaling means bigger organization, then you can see mission drift, because suddenly whatever the organization is trying to accomplish begins to change in order to support this organizational desire to be bigger. Now that's one way that there's mission drift, and that's perhaps not a good way, but there are some good ways where there's mission drift, where as you're scaling, you're learning, you're discovering new challenges, new problems, new ways to solve the problem, and you adjust the mission of the organization based on what you've learned so that you can be more effective, right? And that's a good kind of mission drift. I mean, that's not really so much drifting as it is realigning, but you can find that you aren't actually trying to pursue the same ends further down your scaling journey than you did when you started. And so that's not always bad. It can be quite a good thing.
I would rather call that pivoting, but that's okay. But yeah, the nuanced use of words, I tell you anyway. So One of the other issues with what you mentioned, pilots, right? And funding of pilots. Yes, you need to, because you need to experiment, you need to find new ways. But very often pilots cannot be scaled, right? Or they do not scale, because doing something as a small experiment is one thing, implementing it at scale and then, operationalizing it is another. So what was the advice you give for people who are, looking at pilots initially, so that they keep in mind a long-term plan rather than just what they are planning to do at that point? Yeah.
Right. So yeah, in the book, we talk about a number of things around this. So the idea that you're piloting, trying something small, and then you're trying it a little bit bigger and so forth. I mean, that's one sort of tactical approach to scaling, but it's not the only one, right? The underlying principle that you're putting in place there is you're trying to align the certainty you have about the impacts you will create with the scale of your operations, the reach of your work, the extent to which it will have an effect on the public. And you want to you want to be in a place of balance between the promise that you're holding out to others and your certainty about whether or not you can meet that promise. And within that framework of sort of certainty and scale, we talk about impact risk. And impact risk is this risk that there are a couple of different kinds of impact risk. One is you're not certain enough given the level of scale that you're operating at. And that's a problem because you could not be fulfilling your promise, or you may be creating something negative that you aren't aware of. There's another kind of impact risk, which is you're too cautious. You're waiting too long. You're waiting to be too certain before you scale. And so what we search for is this kind of Goldilocks middle place, which is, sort of, acceptable impact risk. And because this is very hard to put a handle on, and because different people are affected in different ways, this is really a place to begin to connect with communities, individuals that are going to be affected by the work that you do, and try to understand where they are with this sense of whether the risk is justified or not. So when you begin to think of scaling in terms of not just the benefits that we're going to get, but the risks we create by doing it, you now have this countervailing idea that helps you think through the work. It helps to mute this scaling imperative where everyone is trying to scale as quickly as possible, and to capture the funding money in the nonprofit world that would go to them, which excludes, when you do that, you exclude other possibilities. So if you're not sure that you really are bringing something that's better than other nonprofits, capturing more of the funding can be can have a negative effect on the public good.
Well, I definitely hope there are a lot of funders and donors hearing you right now, because that's such sage advice. I, at one time in my life, almost thought I should start in awards titled My First Award, because I felt like, it was the same people over and over again who get the awards, who get the donors, who get the funds, and who gets the projects. It's like people just want to play safe. They just don't want to explore, go deeper, spend more time to find new innovators on the ground. Of course, luckily things have changed a lot more now, but I'm talking about like 10 years ago when I got started. It was so frustrating, it was like nobody would be open to looking and listening to anything new, because they just went the poster boys, they just went the poster girls, and that's it, and would not try anything else. So yeah,
well, it's a strategy to address the risk, right? Whenever you're funding, you're trying to make some prediction of what will happen in the future. And if you have a track record with a particular group or some individuals, then you have a better handle on what will happen in the future. And I think what drives this is a fear of what I think is incorrectly called failure. So not achieving what we set out to achieve. And I don't really think we should be viewing that as failure. If you think of it, of scaling as taking this innovation, this new idea that's popped into somebody's head and bringing it along as far as it should go into the world, there are going to be times when that new idea, along that journey, you realize this isn't the right idea. And so you stop. And that can be viewed as failure by some. But that's actually called learning. In science, that is the predominant thing that happens with every new idea, is that it moves along and then you realize it doesn't work. And publishing those results and understanding those results and understanding why it didn't work is as important, if not more important, than publishing when it does work, because then you have really helped other innovators to narrow their focus to not pursue that same branch that didn't look like it was going to pay off. So I think we should be accepting a greater level of risk if we want innovation, and we should have a more systematic way of funding a portfolio of diverse ideas so that we can learn more quickly where these ideas are competing with each other and we can assess them. And this is typically not how funding works. Funding works by looking at each organization and believing that it is going to be the one that solves the problem.
Absolutely. And I think it's that burden of success or the expectations of success that really stops innovation, I think, more often than not, right? Again, I guess, when you look at innovators and you look at scale, you don't always feel they go side by side, or they go at two extremes where, because you are innovative, you scale very rapidly, or the other alternative, because you're so innovative, you land up being in a niche segment, So here I want to really talk about maybe failures, as you spoke about earlier. And people don't really talk about failures, right? Even though we like to say it's about learning, and we like to say, we don't really share too many failures about ourselves. So I'm going to ask you, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, what are some of the failures, or other, should I say, learning lessons that you perhaps that you can share?
Are you referring to organizations I've worked with that have not been successful in some way, or are you talking about my personal life, or what domain are we on?
No, not personal life, but professional. I mean, because you straddling both sides, right? An academic, and as well as this book shows, and you say about this book has been based on your work with NGOs on the ground. So while you were doing this, were there any incidents of failures or lessons that could be learned, both from yourself or from the NGOs themselves?
Yeah, well, I think that there are many modes of failure, especially when you're considering this in terms of the public good, rather than just whether an organization has failed or not. I think it's much more interesting to think about failure in terms of how the public good has not been served well. And so we have 4 principles in the book, that you have to, one's justification, there's optimal scale, there's coordination, and then there's something we call dynamic evaluation. So those sort of are the large categories in which we describe and discuss ideas around scaling. Now, one of them is coordination. And this is, not a radical idea, but if you're setting out to create meaningful change in a complex environment, it's unlikely that as an organization, you're going to do that entirely on your own. If only because you're operating in an environment where other organizations are also trying to address either the same issues or their work has some effect on the problems you're hoping to solve. And when that coordination doesn't work well, we can see really strange, even perverse effects with respect to the public good. So one of the things I show in my workshops is the picture of a village, which was shared with me by Engineers Without Borders. And in this village, there are 3 wells that have been drilled. And each well was drilled by a different NGO. And each NGO had a mandate to scale, and scaling was measured in terms of how many wells they drilled. So they were going each independently, without thinking about who else was there, would go out and drill these wells. And if you look at this picture, the wells are right next to each other. So it's not as if the second one who came along knew there was already a well there, but they were pushed so far in their belief that they had to meet these numbers for their indicators that they would drill the hole. Right? That's a form of failure to me. There are 2 villages that don't have wells because they went there instead. And this village is really no better off because it has 3 wells rather than 1. So that is failure on more of a sort of a systems level, how we work together to create this change. And I think for me, that's a much more interesting part of the failure problem to think about. When organizations set out to solve a problem with an innovation and they find the innovation doesn't provide the result they hoped for, I don't really see that as failure. I just see that as a normal part of the process. If you're a designer, and this is probably a difference between a designer's mind and a manager's mind. Managers come together, they think about the problem, they come up with one solution, they put all their eggs in that basket, and if it doesn't work, they feel like it's been a problem. Designers say, well, what are like 100 solutions to this? What are 1,000? And how can we judge which of these has more promise? And that, to me, is a really much more fruitful way to go about this, because you're expecting that most of these ideas are not going to bear the fruit you hope they will. And that, I think that's much healthier and it's much more realistic, and it gets us to a good result more quickly.
Absolutely. And again, here, I think this will be a good point for a lot of our audience members to remember, when they are doing anything, is to please look around first, before you get started. So yeah, and sometimes it can be a very obvious physical thing, and sometimes it can be an invisible or an intangible, but it means almost the same thing. Yeah. And of course, you mentioned about your workshop, and we are definitely looking forward to your workshop at the Rise World Summit, and we are hoping many of our audience members are going to be looking at that as well and joining you there, because I think a live masterclass from John is something I'm looking forward to for sure. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. John, maybe one last, I know we are running out of time now, but maybe one last, talk on monitoring and evaluation, because as I said, you straddle the world of academics and then the NGOs on the ground. I think there's a lot more need for academicians to be on the ground and vice versa. So, the bridge conversations that kind of help. Because I think in terms of the education and awareness around impact assessments, monitoring and evaluation still has a long way to go. Because when you look at practitioners, they understand how to do something, but not necessarily how to measure. And as you said, just because an indicator has been put there, they just go out there and do it, So what do you think is the real need now in terms of education and awareness around monitoring and evaluation?
Yeah. Well, that's a very tough question to answer. There's a lot about our current way of working that I would say that most practitioners are not satisfied with. Right? We're working with what we know how to do within a system that demands certain things, and we may not want to admit it, but what happens really with NGOs and nonprofits around the world, but especially in development, is that this is very market driven. There are funders and increasingly private investors who would like to see certain things happen. And in organizations that are almost always viewing themselves, probably realistically, as resource constrained, that are willing to do the things that are being asked for. And even if they don't make a lot of sense, they'll say yes, they'll raise their hand, we'll go do that. And then they're trying to do what they think makes sense and what doesn't make sense at the same time. They're trying to negotiate both of those worlds. I think a change that might help, which would be a very difficult one to put into practice, unfortunately, is having a more exploratory and long-term view towards change. That as a funder, I think what you would really want to do if you're solving a problem for which there is no ready-made solution is that you would like to get many different organizations working on that in some way, and then following that over a fairly long period of time. I mean, the funding window of interest tends to be somewhere between 3 to 5 years, when the kind of change we're looking for probably takes decades or generations. So taking that longer view, having many diverse solutions being put into place at the same time from which we can learn, I think that brings us to creating meaningful impact much sooner, even though it sounds like it's pushing it off. So that would be the change, the primary change I'd like to see. It's very difficult to imagine how that gets put into place because of the various pressures that have created this, the system that we all have to work within right now.
I think that's a lot more to be done, as you rightly said, and hopefully we are all trying to move that needle also. You have been the president of the American Evaluation Association, right?
Yes.
And, you know, as president of such a prestigious association that has so many members, and there's so much that has to be done, and there's so much of knowledge that is available, what more can we do to make it easier for those who are not members, who can't afford to be members, who are not known, who are not aware? What more can we do to build and take that knowledge to others?
Well, this is a real interest of mine. I feel as though we are in a difficult period with supporting and training evaluators. The first problem I see, certainly true in North America, I think it's probably true around much of the world, is that if you are pursuing training at a university level or a graduate level, that your opportunities are shrinking. There are fewer places to go where you can get real training in this. So that's one problem. The second problem is that the things that we think someone should learn, especially in development, are the things that funders tell us we should be doing, which aren't necessarily, it's certainly not everything that we should learn, and they aren't necessarily the best things that we need to learn. So you can find infinite number of workshops to teach you how to put together a log frame, but you're really not going to find many opportunities to understand that at a level that's deep enough that helps you promote the effectiveness of the organization. You learn how to meet the kind of funder's mandate for reporting, which really isn't what should be driving our work. You know, the basic principles and methods that make evaluation what it is. The third piece is that we are competing more with other disciplines that are looking at the same issues. Some of these are relatively new, like there's a whole movement around what's sometimes called impact management and measurement, that impact investors and social entrepreneurs tend to align themselves with, coming more or less out of business schools. But you also see economists increasingly engaged in this work, and people from other social sciences. And it's good. It's good that there are more ways of looking at it. But somewhere what's getting lost, I think, is the very important thing that evaluation brings to this, which is how we understand value and values. And we don't go into this with an assumption that the values I hold as an evaluator are the ones that should be driving this. We don't go into this with the belief that what the organizations funding us tell us is good are necessarily good. We need to find out from humans. We need to understand how humans place value on the work that we're doing and the consequences of that work. And we have to find ways to sort of reconcile those differences of opinion. Most other disciplines don't come at this work with that same view. And I think even if we get training now, increasingly that part of the equation is not considered. So methods of understanding what humans think is important and good, and methods for bringing that into an evaluative conclusion are really increasingly rare for us to learn about.
You know, John, I'm going to need a completely different interview with you to just talk about value and value. Because that's a topic that is so close to my heart, and you know, the
Yeah.
work that I'm doing on the value co-creation framework. So yes, we will
Mhm.
have one more interview to discuss that.
Okay.
But any last words, any last thoughts? Happy to get those as well.
Well, I think that the topics that we've covered are, many of them are on the minds of funders and practitioners right now. And as much as I've spent time thinking about them and I've written about them, I don't think any of us have an ideal solution that makes all this simple, a step-by-step kind of activity that we can engage in. We're really depending on the skill of the practitioners and their ability to collaborate, work together, learn from each other. And I think we're going to be that way for a long time. So investing in those efforts like this, I think is quite important. So I'm glad to be a part of that and happy to support your work moving forward.
Thank you so much, John. It takes a leader to admit I'm not on top of it. There is still way to go. And for us, that is the definition of thought leadership, right? Because that's exactly what we want to show. How much can we keep pushing ourselves? Because if you say, I know it all, or I have got it, you know, spot on, I think that just shows that we still don't know what we don't know, as they say, right? And so thank you so very much for being our thought leader today and for sharing your insights, sharing your experience, sharing your knowledge, and above all, sharing your concerns. You know, I think that also is so critical for us to keep pushing, keep moving, because finally, I think for all of us, we want a better world and a greener planet. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.